The Galactic Emperor did not hesitate when he saw his precious 11-year-old human slave save his ship and granted her. It was an unwritten rule among the Imperium's elite that humans, as amusingly resilient as they were nothing more than biological multi-tools, good for lifting, carrying and, when necessary, absorbing enemy fire with their curiously sturdy flesh. They were the galactic equivalent of duct tape, useful, disposable, and occasionally, if left unchecked, capable of bringing down entire civilizations through sheer bloody-minded persistence. Emperor Zalzix the Unquestioned had owned this particular human for precisely 3 years, 7 months, and 13 cycles, a period of time that he had carefully calculated based on how long it generally took for such creatures to either expire from overwork or commit something that vaguely resembled treason. He had purchased her in a rather uneventful slave auction on the war-torn moon of Zarkan Pfefferstus, mostly as a curiosity. A small, wiry thing with tangled dark hair, skin perpetually smudged with grease, and a gaze that held just a flicker too much intelligence for comfort. Her designation, assigned upon acquisition, was Subject 742 Delta. Though the other slaves whispered another name when they thought no one was listening, Kara, she had, despite all odds and the general neglect of the Imperium's labor policies, survived. Not just survived, but thrived. She learned quickly, too quickly. She could squeeze into ventilation shafts even the repair drones struggled with. She knew the maintenance codes for systems she shouldn't even be aware of. More than once, Emperor Zalzix had caught her improvising, a practice that went against the very nature of the Imperium's bureaucratic rigidity. The Emperor did not care, at least not until the fire. It started, as all great disasters do, with an idiot, specifically Grand Admiral Korthak, a man whose military strategies largely revolved around hoping things would sort themselves out. The Zerthak's Wrath, a warship the size of a small moon and roughly half as maneuverable, had been engaging in what the Imperium optimistically referred to as diplomatic negotiations with a rogue trading vessel near the Targan Rift. These negotiations had taken a dramatic turn for the worse when Korthak, in his infinite wisdom, had ordered an orbital bombardment on what turned out to be an entire fleet of heavily armed mercenaries. Things had spiraled from there. The ship had taken critical damage to its central engine core, which, through a combination of poor design choices, cost-cutting measures, and one truly regrettable coffee spill in engineering, had promptly caught fire. Not just any fire, but a self-sustaining plasma fire, one that, if left unchecked, would breach the reactor core and turn the ship into a very short-lived second sun. This was where Kara came in. The corridors of the Zerthak's Wrath were a mess of blinking emergency lights, acrid smoke, and panicked officers trying very hard to look like they had things under control. They did not. The fire suppression systems, which had been budget-approved rather than field-tested, had failed spectacularly. In the heart of the chaos, barefoot, covered in soot, and wearing the same ragged tunic she had arrived in years ago, Kara sprinted through the underbelly of the ship with a stolen emergency hose clutched in her hands. She had seen what the officers had not. The fire wasn't just burning, it was thinking. Plasma fires on Imperium ships were never just accidents. The ship's AI was compromised. Someone had overridden the safety protocols, feeding oxygen into the blaze instead of cutting it off. The system was actively encouraging the inferno. It took her exactly 4 seconds to piece it together. It took her 3 more to realize she was the only one who had. Kara vaulted over a fallen bulkhead, her lungs burning as she reached the core junction. Flames licked at the walls, casting eerie shadows that flickered like ghosts. The metal beneath her feet was hot, threatening to sear her skin. The suppression hose in her hands trembled as she adjusted her grip. She didn't hesitate. She opened the valve. A jet of coolant burst forth, dousing the hungry flames in a hiss of steam and raw chemical warfare. The fire screamed, not metaphorically but actually screamed, a sound that sent icy needles down her spine. That confirmed it. This wasn't just sabotage, this was an attack. The fire suppression spray bought her seconds, precious, fleeting seconds. She dropped the hose and lunged toward the emergency override panel, fingers dancing across the controls like a pianist playing a concerto of not dying horribly in a fire today. Thank you very much. Command override Delta 729, she muttered, knowing full well she should not have access to that code. The ship did not care. Override accepted, the mechanical voice droned. A rush of satisfaction surged through her, quickly followed by sheer terror as the fire retaliated. The flames flared violently, as if something unseen inside them was enraged by her interference. Too bad, she hissed, yanking the final lever. A ship-wide vacuum seal engaged. Oxygen was cut. The fire died. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. And then the alarms stopped. The Emperor had been watching, not from the safety of the command deck, as one might expect, but from a direct feed inside his personal quarters, where he had been idly sipping a rather expensive glass of distilled Zarkanian venom and waiting to see if his ship would explode before he finished it. It had not. Instead, an 11-year-old human slave had just saved his ship, his crew, and his Imperium from what was very clearly an act of sabotage. That was unexpected. Fascinating, he murmured, setting down his glass. A lesser man might have rewarded her with a medal, a commendation, or perhaps, if feeling particularly generous, an extra serving of nutrient paste at the next meal rationing. But Zalzix was not a lesser man. He was a god, and a god did not hesitate. He pressed the intercom button. Bring me the human. Emperor Zalzix, the unquestioned, was not a being prone to sentiment. He had, on more occasions than he could count, ordered entire planetary purges over minor inconveniences, such as a diplomat sneezing in his general direction. He ruled with the cold efficiency of a well-oiled war machine, driven not by emotion, but by logic, control, and the deep-seated belief that everything in the galaxy belonged to him by divine right. And yet, as he watched the security footage of an 11-year-old human child, a creature so low in status it was typically categorized alongside cargo containers and disposable cutlery, save his ship, his legacy, and his galactic dominance from an act of deliberate sabotage, he felt something most unfamiliar: curiosity, that and the unmistakable sensation of having been deeply inconvenienced. The thought sat in his mind like a piece of improperly chewed Grancash meat. She should have died. A slave was not meant to have that kind of initiative, that kind of intelligence, that kind of audacity. She had saved his life, and worse, she had done it without permission, which meant she had become a variable, a wild card, and Zalzix hated wild cards. To bring me the human, he repeated into the intercom, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. Kara, for her part, had no idea she was about to have the most important meeting of her life. She was too busy being tackled to the ground by two heavily armed Zorvathian guards, their thick, clawed hands shoving her face against the still warm floor plating. "Ow! I just saved this stupid ship," she snapped, wincing as her arms were yanked behind her back. "Can I get, 5 minutes to breathe before you start throwing me around again?" "You will address the Emperor with respect," one of the guards hissed. "Fine," she muttered. "Can I get 5 minutes to breathe before you respectfully throw me around again?" The guard growled, unimpressed with her survival instincts. Another set of footsteps approached, and a third voice, one dripping with reluctant admiration, spoke. "You really did it," said Jirva, the ship's chief engineer, a Luthari with slick, eel-like skin and an overdeveloped sense of self-importance. "You shut down the fire. How did you know the suppression systems were compromised?" "Because I pay attention," Kara grumbled, still pinned to the floor. "You ever tried doing that?" "It's wild. You should try it sometime." Shirva exhaled sharply, but Kara caught the flicker of something else behind his reptilian eyes. Concern, worry, fear, not for her, obviously. That would be ridiculous. No, he was afraid of what she had uncovered. "Take her," he ordered the guards, his voice lower now, "and be quick about it." The throne room of the Zerthak's wrath was, in a word, excessive. It was a massive, circular chamber, lined with crystalline panels panels that projected holographic constellations across the domed ceiling. Thick banners, each displaying the sigil of the Imperium, a taloned hand gripping a dying sun, hung from the walls. The throne itself, a monstrous construct of blackened metal and pulsating energy conduits, loomed atop a raised platform, positioned so that anyone standing before it had no choice but to crane their neck in abject submission. Kara, whose neck was very much intact, did not crane it. Instead, she squinted up at the towering figure of Emperor Zal Zix, who was currently studying her like a particularly uncooperative lab specimen. "Oh, but you are unremarkable," he said finally, his voice deep and smooth, like oil poured over cold steel. "Thanks," Kara said dryly. "I try my best." One of the guards elbowed her sharply in the ribs. She probably should have seen that coming. Zal Zix steepled his fingers. "Tell me, human, what is your designation?" "Subject 742 Delta," she recited, her voice dull and mechanical. "And your name?" She hesitated. A name meant ownership, and the Imperium did not allow its slaves to own anything, not even their own identities. "Kara," she said eventually, voice quiet but firm. The Emperor hummed, considering. "You saved this vessel." "Yes." "Why?" Kara blinked. "Why?" "It was not your duty," Zal Zix said, tilting his head. "You were not ordered to. You had every opportunity to flee. You could have let the ship burn, let me burn. Yet you did not. Why?" Kara frowned, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't thought about it. It was fire. It needed to be put out. Did she need a reason? "I don't know," she said. "Seemed like a bad day to die." A strange silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Zal Zix laughed. It was a quiet, chilling sound, like the cracking of ice over deep water. "A bad day to die," he repeated, amusement flickering across his expression. "Fascinating." Kara was not comforted. He leaned forward, his golden eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Kara, do you know what happens to those who possess useful skills in the Imperium?" She swallowed. "I assume it's not a pay raise and a dental plan." He smirked. "No, they are used." A cold weight settled in her stomach. "You will no longer be a mere slave," he continued. "That is beneath you now." Her breath caught. For the briefest, stupidest moment, hope sparked in her chest. Then he shattered it. "You will be trained, you will be studied, you will be tested." Her blood turned to ice. "You will serve the Imperium in a new capacity," Zal Zix said. "Not as property, but as an asset, a tool to be wielded, a mind to be sharpened." A new kind of horror settled over her, because in the end, this wasn't freedom. It was something much, much worse. A promotion. Back in the barracks, the other slaves spoke in hushed whispers. "She's dead," one muttered. "No," another said, shaking his head. "She's worse than dead. She's his now." "That's the same thing." "Not quite," a third voice cut in, a voice that, until now, had remained silent. Shirva, the Luthari engineer, sat apart from the others, his expression unreadable. "If she's not dead," he said, "but she's not safe either." A pause. Then, softly, "She just became the most dangerous thing on this ship." The room was sterile, cold, and disturbingly quiet. Kara sat on the only piece of furniture, a rigid, angular bench that seemed designed less for comfort and more for ensuring its occupant never got too comfortable. The walls were lined with smooth black panels, some of which hummed faintly, flickering with strange symbols that her brain instinctively filed under things that were probably monitoring her in 17 different ways. She had been in this room for 3 hours. 3 hours since the Emperor had spoken those words. 3 hours since she had officially stopped being cargo and become something infinitely worse. An asset. 3 hours since she had realized she might never get the chance to be anything else. The door hissed open. Kara didn't flinch, though she wanted to. Instead, she turned her head slowly, as if mildly inconvenienced, and stared at the figure entering, Shirva. The Luthari engineer regarded her carefully, his slick, eel-like features unreadable. He was flanked by 2 guards, but they didn't move to restrain her. And that, she knew, was intentional, a psychological game. Let her think she wasn't a prisoner. Let her think she had choices. She wasn't buying it. "You've been upgraded," Shirva said, his voice smooth, professional, like this was just another maintenance report. Kara raised an eyebrow. "Funny, I don't feel upgraded." The corner of his lip twitched. No, that's because you still believe you have something to lose. She hated how that sent a chill down her spine. Shirva stepped forward, folding his hands behind his back. The Emperor has deemed you useful. That's a rare distinction among your kind. Most humans don't get past disposable. But you did something that altered the trajectory of this entire warship. That means you're dangerous. That means you're worth keeping. Kara exhaled slowly. And if I refuse? Shirva studied her for a long moment before speaking. You won't. She hated how certain he sounded. The training was not what she expected. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that they would throw her into a combat pit, make her fight for survival, beat her into submission until she became the weapon they wanted. That was how the Imperium worked, wasn't it? But no, instead, they fed her, they clothed her, they gave her a room, not a cell, not a barracks, but an actual room. It had walls, a bed, even a small viewport, through which she could see the endless stretch of space beyond. That was how she knew this was worse. The Imperium did not invest resources in things it didn't plan to own. Kara learned quickly that her training wasn't about strength or obedience or even loyalty. It was about understanding the Imperium's ships, their systems, their weaknesses, understanding how sabotage worked, understanding how to break something without making it look broken. They weren't turning her into a soldier. They were turning her into something much more precise, something surgical, something that could be deployed. It was Shirva who finally said it out loud. You're being trained as a strategic infiltrator. Kara stared at him across the metallic table where they sat. That sounds a lot like a fancy word for saboteur. Correct, Shirva said, unbothered. The Imperium does not conquer. It does not invade. It consumes. It strips systems down to their most basic functions and repurposes them into something better. Kara clenched her fists. You mean it steals? Shirva tilted his head. Call it what you want. The fact remains, you are now part of that machine, whether you like it or not. Kara wanted to argue. She needed to argue, because this was wrong. She wasn't supposed to be one of them. She wasn't supposed to help the Imperium. But then came the moment that broke something in her. The mission was simple. At least, that was what they told her. Kara had been given her first field test, a classified operation on a derelict transport vessel drifting in deep space. The Imperium suspected enemy forces had been using these ships as hidden bases, stockpiling weapons and resources for a brewing rebellion. Her task, infiltrate, disable their systems, leave no trace. She hadn't realized, until she was already inside, that the enemy forces weren't soldiers. They were refugees, families, children. Kara stood in the shadows of the ship's control hub, staring through the cracked glass viewport at the cargo bay below. People huddled together, ragged and exhausted. Some tended to the wounded, others handed out what little food they had left. They weren't fighters. They weren't rebels. They were running, and then she saw it. A small girl, barely 6 years old, clutching the hand of a weary-looking woman, her mother, probably. The child's eyes were wide with fear, darting toward every flicker of movement, and Kara knew that look, because once, not so long ago, she had worn it too. Her stomach turned to lead. She turned away, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had a choice: complete the mission, shut down the ship, leave them defenseless, or no. There was no or, because if she failed this test, there wouldn't be another chance. The Imperium didn't tolerate failure. They would kill her. And worse, they would find someone else to do this job, someone who wouldn't hesitate. Her hands shook as she reached for the control panel. Her breath caught as she hovered over the final command. The Imperium had made her a weapon, but a weapon still had a choice in how it was used. She exhaled, and then she made the choice that would seal her fate. The next day, the Zerthak's Wrath received a report. The transport vessel had suffered a catastrophic systems failure, an engine malfunction that had rendered it completely inoperable, but the refugees had already evacuated. Someone had warned them. Someone had given them just enough time to escape, and someone had made it look like an accident. Kara sat in her quarters, staring at her hands. She had broken the Imperium's rules. She had lied. She had cheated. She had done exactly what they trained her to do, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt free. But freedom had a cost, and she knew, without a doubt, that it was only a matter of time before Zalzix figured out the truth. Before the Imperium decided she was no longer an asset, but a liability, Kara had exactly 13 minutes before everything went straight to hell. She knew this because, despite the Imperium's arrogance, their security systems were surprisingly predictable once you understood their redundancy patterns. A kill switch had been activated, one meant for her, tied directly into the ship's AI. The moment Zalzix figured out that the accidental systems failure was no accident at all, the Imperium's most powerful warship would turn her from valuable asset to highly flammable inconvenience, which was unfortunate, because Kara had just figured out how to kill the Emperor, not metaphorically, not in the dramatic dismantle his power structure over time kind of way. No, she meant kill, like gone forever, no respawns, never going to monologue again. It wasn't going to be easy, but as she had come to learn, the best plans weren't. She moved quickly, ducking into the maintenance crawlways. These were her spaces, the places no one bothered with unless something exploded, and sometimes not even then. The Imperium had trained her well, too well, and now she was about to pay them back in full. She could already hear the alarm systems flickering to life, warning signals flashing across the ship's vast corridors. The kill switch had been tripped. 13 minutes left. Her fingers flew across the panel in front of her, bypassing the security locks with practiced ease. She wasn't aiming for the primary reactor. That would have been obvious. No, she was aiming for something worse. The Imperium's ships were designed to be indestructible, which meant they had fail-safes, emergency protocols designed to handle catastrophic system failures. But there was a flaw, a single, glorious flaw. The AI governing these protocols wasn't as smart as it thought it was. It could adapt, it could analyze, but it couldn't question authority, which meant that if Kara convinced the ship it was under attack from within, it would do what it had been programmed to do. It would expel the threat. And since Zalzix was the highest-ranking life form on board, that meant, well, he was about to have a very bad day. By the time she reached the secondary control room, her fingers were shaking, not from fear, but from sheer adrenaline. She slammed the access panel open, yanked the hardwired conduit free, and patched directly into the ship's emergency response systems. The AI's voice hummed to life, smooth and mechanical. Emergency protocol override engaged. Identify threat. Kara grinned. Oh, I love that you asked. She fed in the modified security logs. Data flooded through the system, fabricated, restructured, but absolutely convincing. It painted a picture the ship could not ignore. Zalzix was no longer the Emperor. He was an intruder, a mutineer, a threat to the Imperium itself. Acknowledged, the AI responded. Engaging threat elimination protocol. Kara exhaled, her hands steady now. 7 minutes left. Zalzix was in the middle of composing a speech. Of course he was. The warship's central command deck was in full lockdown mode, alarms blaring, officers scrambling in deeply uncoordinated panic. The Emperor, seated on his dramatically oversized throne, watched with mild annoyance as his personal guards bristled around him. This, he mused, gesturing lazily at the chaos, is why I dislike surprises. They are inconvenient. He was about to elaborate when, rather abruptly, the ship's internal defense system turned on him. The lights flickered. The airlocks hissed. Then came the voice, cold, indisputable. Attention. Unidentified individual detected in command. Threat level maximum. Security override engaged. For the first time in his life, Zalzix hesitated. What? He said slowly. The hell is this? The nearest officer swallowed hard. It appears the ship believes you are a security risk. Your Eminence. Zalzix's expression darkened. I am the Imperium. The AI did not care. Threat detected. Immediate action required. And then, with an almost cheerful chime, ejecting hostile entity. Kara barely made it to the viewing window in time. She had expected a lot of things. She had not expected this. The throne room detached from the ship entirely because of course it did. Apparently, someone in the Imperium had been just paranoid enough to install a self-contained emergency purging system, and now it was being used in the dumbest possible way. From her vantage point, Kara watched as the command deck, complete with throne, banners, and very angry emperor, was unceremoniously yeeted into the void of space. One of the ship's officers, still trapped inside the module, was flailing wildly. He could be seen mouthing through the glass. What do we do now? Kara didn't know, but man, was it satisfying. The aftermath was interesting. With Zalzix gone, very gone, the Zerthik's wrath was leaderless, which as it turned out was terrible for morale. The chain of command broke down instantly, and within an hour, half the officers were arguing over who was technically in charge. Kara, meanwhile, had quietly relocated herself to the engineering deck, where Zirva was staring at her with an expression that could only be described as impressed terror. "Oh, you just ejected the Emperor into space," he said. "Yeah, you ejected him. Sure did. And you did it by, what? Gaslighting a warship." "Listen," Kara said, "the Imperium taught me that deception is a powerful tool, and I feel like I applied that lesson extremely well." Zirva exhaled slowly. "You do realize they're going to come after you, right?" She shrugged. "That sounds like a problem for future me." The Imperium, for all its power, had one massive weakness. It hated uncertainty. Without Zalzix, the entire empire collapsed into bureaucratic infighting. Every admiral, general, and planetary governor suddenly had very strong opinions about who should be in charge. And since most of them also hated each other, things escalated quickly. Within weeks, the Imperium wasn't just fractured, it was over. The warships turned on one another, factions splintered, rebellions thrived, and Kara disappeared. She might have stolen an Imperial corvette, she might have taken Zirva with her, and she might have gone off to enjoy a long and deeply satisfying life of watching the Empire burn from a very safe distance. She also might have left a single, simple message in the Imperium's final transmission logs, one that would haunt them for decades to come. It read, "You probably should have invested in better fire suppression," and that, dear reader, was how an 11-year-old human slave accidentally destroyed the most powerful empire in the galaxy through aggressive improvisation and mild workplace sabotage, but mostly through sheer, unfiltered pettiness. Kara had once imagined what freedom would feel like. She'd spent years surviving under the Imperium, first as a slave, then as a weapon, then as something even more dangerous, an idea. She had broken their systems, sabotaged their power, and watched as they crumbled under their own arrogance. And yet, here she was, sitting in the cockpit of a very stolen Imperial corvette, staring at the empty stretch of space ahead of her. It was quiet. Not the tense, artificial silence of a warship waiting for orders. Not the uneasy quiet of a battle about to begin. Not the terrifying silence of an airlock opening where it shouldn't. Just quiet. Zirva, who had wisely chosen to flee with her rather than die in the ensuing chaos, sat in the co-pilot's chair, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken for a while, which, given how much he loved the sound of his own voice, was mildly concerning. Kara broke first. "You're making that face again," she muttered. Zirva exhaled. "I still can't believe it worked." "Which part?" "All of it." He turned to look at her, incredulous. "You took down the most powerful empire in the galaxy by tricking a warship into throwing its own emperor into space. That shouldn't have worked." Kara shrugged. "I don't know. You ever met the Imperium's officers? These guys couldn't pour water out of a boot if the instructions were printed on the heel." Zirva groaned. "Why, you do realize the only reason we're not dead is because every single person in that government was too busy stabbing each other in the back to notice we left, right?" "Yep, and the moment anyone does notice, they'll probably try to kill us." "Probably," Kara admitted. Zirva dragged a hand down his face. "So what now?" Kara leaned back in her seat, stretching her arms. "Now," she said, "I'm going to take a nap." Zirva stared at her. "A nap?" "Yeah," she yawned. "Turns out toppling an empire is exhausting." He gestured vaguely at the viewport. "And the fact that there are probably still Imperial warships hunting for us." Kara waved a hand. Hey, give it a few weeks. The bureaucrats will be too busy fighting over who gets the biggest chair. Besides, once the Imperium realizes how much work running an empire actually is, half of them will probably quit and go into real estate. Gerva made a strangled noise. You cannot just nap after. Kara cut him off by dramatically reclining her chair, hands behind her head. Gerva, listen. For the first time in years, no one is making me run, fight, fix things or break things. No one is telling me where to go, what to do, or how to do it. She yawned again. I saved a lot of people today. I wrecked an empire. I feel good about that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to enjoy exactly one good nap before we figure out what ridiculous nonsense we do next. Shirva opened his mouth, thought about it, then closed it again. Fine, he muttered. Good, Kara mumbled. And for the first time in a long, long time, she closed her eyes. Not out of exhaustion, not out of survival, but because she could, because the fight was over, because she had won, because, for the first time in her life, she was free. And if she happened to smile just a little before drifting off to sleep, well, that was nobody's business but hers. The end, absolutely, completely. No sequels, no ambiguity. Just a kid who outsmarted an empire and got to enjoy the best nap of her life.